Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week is the Eventide Instant Phaser Mark II. The Instant Phaser is an all-time classic, originally released in 1971 by Eventide Clockworks. It was designed to replace a tape flange, which was somewhat of a difficult process to set up and get to work exactly the way that you wanted it. So what they did was they created an effect that would create something that was very similar to that. Now, the way they actually apply this sort of modulating delay type of effect is different in terms of the way that it's actually set up within the system, but the same basic idea can sort of happen here. Now, with the original device, essentially what you have are the controls that are set up here. What you have here is an in-out switch. You have a depth control. The depth control is interesting. We'll actually get to all of what they do, but I'll just kind of go through the overall. The remote is just a remote control, so you can actually control this with an external modulation wheel. You have a built-in oscillator. This is the manual control. So this controls the phase relationship, but it allows you to work it manually. There's an envelope follower that has a threshold and a release, and then you have the modulation mode setting. So you can either work it manual, work it by the oscillator section. You could work it with the envelope section, right, with the envelope follower here, or you could work it by remote control, which is over here. So all of those things sort of come into effect. And then there is an extra section here which allows you to integrate more modern DAW type of functions. You have an input gain control, output gain control. There is a sync button, and this allows you to set the oscillator settings to musical values as opposed to just frequencies, which is what you see here. There's a retrigger mode. This is actually quite cool because you can get the oscillator to start always at the same cycle if you automate this function into place. So that way, once you capture a certain sound, you can get it to be consistent. Otherwise, it will just kind of, the oscillator may just keep modulating and you'll end up with a different sound every time that you play it back. This is the age function is really an interesting one. This is the feature where they realized over time that the components that are part of the original units degrade. And so what they did is they factored in. So this is what a current brand new one would sound like, which is at 25% mode. If you go to new, it sort of takes that out and makes it whistle clean. And then if you go to old, you can create some what would be 100-year-old effect, and this is already almost 50 years old. So and so that creates some cool effects. There's a feedback on the whole system that allows you to exaggerate the effect. You'll see that. And you could also trigger everything with a sidechain. So you could feed a signal into a sidechain input and use that to key the envelope movement. So that's another fine feature. And then we got the output. So let's go over just a couple things here. With the in-out, that just basically takes the effect in and out. The depth control, you see it goes from 0 to 100%. So this is a little bit interesting because 100% is a 50-50 mix. So if you put this on the insert, like right now I just have this on the insert of a vocal stem, and I'm going to run some vocals through it so you'll hear the effect. I'll go through some of the different options and you'll hear it. So I'll have it here. This will be at 50-50. If I swing it all the way to 0, you would think that would be all dry, but it's actually the opposite. Now you have 100% effect. So the reason why they don't call it mix control or wet dry control is because it's the depth control. So with any kind of modulation effect where you're creating like a phase or a flange or a chorus effect, you need to have both the original effect and the modulated delay effect in order to create the effect. It's the two of them combined that actually creates the effect. So this gives you the 50-50 balance, and it gives you more depth, or you hear the effect more clearly. As you back away from it, you just start to hear the modulated effect, and I'll demonstrate that. The remote control, simple. That just, when you put it on, if you flip this on, it switches here to remote. Just means you can set up an external MIDI modulation wheel, record that information onto a MIDI track or instrument track, and then you could basically perform the effect that you're looking for in there. The oscillator just allows you to set the rate. So if you're working with the oscillator, so if I click on the button here, it will switch the mode over here to oscillator. It will just do a normal modulation. Again, I can work it with actual frequencies, or I can work with it in sync, so it happens over a period of time. The manual button is kind of an interesting one. By default, it comes straight up. Now, what happens here is that there are a series of electronic phase shift networks. There's 8 of them that actually kind of factor in, and the filters create basically 4 notch points that you end up giving you the sort of sweeping effect. So the way this effect was created in the original hardware device was not the typical delay, modulating a delay kind of thing, because actually at that time in the late 60s, 1970, when they were creating this device, that technology was extremely expensive to create something that would actually be a digital delay. And then to modulate it and all that, it was very difficult. So they could have released a device, but it would have been thousands and thousands of dollars. I don't know what this cost originally, but it wasn't that much. So they found another interesting way to do it, and that's one way to do it. It also has 2 outputs. This actually has 2 outputs. It has a main output and auxiliary output, the hardware does, and they're slightly different. So the auxiliary output has 2 less notch points than the other side, than the main output. So it gives you like a slightly spread sound when you operate it in stereo. Okay, so that's that there. The envelope is pretty straightforward. When you work with the envelope, basically the gain of the input signal is what drives it. So you set a threshold, and the release determines how long the actual movement, the modulation movement takes to decay. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic control that you don't typically see, but that allows you to really shape where the effect happens, which is quite cool. And again, if you hit the sidechain button, you can key that externally. So you could feed a vocal, have this on a synth track, and have the vocal key the modulation of the synth and create some kind of effect along those lines. Loads of ways that you can play around with that type of stuff. So this is a fun one. Let's just get into some basics here. I'll just play a little bit of audio unaffected, and then I'll start hacking away here.
Hold tight to the feeling. Don't go when the sun goes down. Sun goes down.
All right, so let's start with the oscillator effect. I'll unbypass this, and we'll just kind of go with this. Oh, actually with the manual control, one thing that I didn't get to, I'm not sure how I didn't skip on this. Essentially what happens is within this filter network, what will happen is there will be certain frequencies that will sort of cancel out and other frequencies that will be accentuated. That's more or less what happens. This allows you to sort of sweep that. So if you go here, it'll cancel out more high frequencies. So you'll get kind of a warmer place where the modulation effect or the sweeping sort of filter effect sort of occurs. If you go up this way, it will make the lower frequencies out of phase or less phase coherent, and so it will shift it, the resultant effect higher. Okay, and this will work. You can also, even though you have the oscillator here, you could shift the center point of it here with the manual control.
Hold tight to the feeling. Don't go when the sun goes down. Sun goes down.
All right, so that's the effect right there. Now let me just show you how that shifts higher and lower in frequency.
Hold tight to the feeling. Don't go when the sun goes down. Sun goes down. You leave and I can't breathe. No air when you're not around.
So if you wanted to do, just to quickly show you here, if I switch this off and just went to a manual effect, I could actually perform this in.
Hold tight to the feeling. Don't go when the sun goes down. Sun goes down.
Not that exciting, or my performance isn't that exciting, but you get the basic idea. So that gives you that option there to shift the tonal character. Now here I have it set to 2 bars. It seems to work pretty well. Now I can actually factor in some of the other things like feedback here to sort of change some of the character or exaggerate the effect.
Hold tight to the feeling. Don't go when the sun goes down. Sun goes down. You leave and I can't breathe. No air when you're not around. Not around. Bright lights in the city streets.
Right, so you could hear how that, really changes the character. And again, you could sort of automate and sort of sweep that in to create really super exaggerated effects. And then the age here, this is kind of an interesting one. I'll just show you what this is like.
Hold tight to the feeling. Don't go when the sun goes down. Sun goes down. You leave and I can't breathe. Nowhere when you're not around. Not around.
So you could you could really, you can kind of create some interesting effects there. If you're, just whatever, looking to make, you know just something a little bit whatever, like it's falling apart, kind of a robotic kind of sound there. So anyway, that's just the aging component. So that's another possibility in there. So we have that. We have the oscillator, and then we have the envelope feature. So let's switch over to the envelope feature. So this is quite cool because here we could set a threshold which determines when the modulation sort of kicks in. And then the modulation is affected by the envelope, so it will sort of sweep. Basically, the more gain, it will sweep more as more gain comes across, and then you could control how long that effect occurs.
Hold tight to the feeling. Don't go when the sun goes down. Sun goes down. You leave and I can't breathe. No air when you're not around. Not around. Bright lights in the city streets. Will you think of me?
So by setting it shorter, you can affect just the part that goes over, which would get more towards the transient and attack elements of it. And then as you go longer, obviously you can hear the more dramatic sweeping effect.
Hold tight to the feeling. Don't go when the sun goes down. Sun goes down. You leave and I can't breathe. No air when you're not around. Not around. Bright lights in the city streets. Will you think of me? Will you think of me? Why let go? I tried 1,000 times, but you're all I need. Yeah, you're all I need. So don't ever let me down. Dark days are over now, and we can get lost in each other's minds. No, I would never let you down. Dark days are over now. When we're together, I feel so alive.
So you can hear how, just with this, how you can really get, creative and create some really unique sounds. This is like an all-time classic device. This is a pretty amazing unit from the past, and I've used it a lot on tons of mixes. It's great. I almost always use it in an insert sort of configuration, and this is just easy to sort of drop it in, and if you want it to happen, like this effect to happen just for a certain section of the song, just automate the bypass, pop it into place for the phrase or phrases that you want it to happen, or maybe you want something to happen across the track the whole time that it plays. Whatever the case is, you can automate it, you can lay it in, and it gives you plenty of tone controls and the unique character of a vintage effect unit for creating a phase effect. It's interesting that in finding these, I find it much easier to create these sort of more dramatic effects with some of the vintage gear than with the newer stuff, and because I think there's just a lot more character that's built into the original unit itself. So very cool one. Just love this original unit, and this is definitely a great upgrade by Eventide on this really amazing processor, one that's worth throwing into your collection if you don't have it already. So there you have it. Plug-in of the week. Mix it with Mike. Eventide Instant Phaser Mark II.